We're going to give folks who are here in the room a chance to meet kind of independently one-on-one to ask questions of staff. For those online, we'll continue to encourage, you'll hear me talk about this in the presentation, to reach out to planning division staff and set an appointment to talk about your individual property. That's really the best way to get information. I want to thank folks for being here tonight. Again, my name is Kelly Housley Glover. I'm the Wasco County Community Development Director, and I've been in partnership with these proposed revisions with the Columbia River Gorge Commission. So I have next to me Christina Wolnikowski, who's the Executive Director of the Columbia River Gorge Commission. She's brought one of our staffers, Mackenzie, here. I'm also joined by several of our fine professional planning division staff, Planning Director Daniel Doherty, Armando and Sean, and again, we'll be all available after the formal presentation to answer kind of questions one-on-one, because land use is really, every situation is different, every property is different, and has unique needs. So we want to make sure we're giving you good quality information. So if you want to hang out after the presentation, we invite you to come talk to staff. We are recording this presentation so it can be made available online, and it will be sent out by Wasco County Public Information Officer over various channels, including the Wasco County website and social media. So if your friends or neighbors weren't able to attend tonight, please let them know they can find this presentation available online. You will also be, if you live in Wasco County in the National Scenic Area, you'll also be receiving a postcard notice in the next week or two, alerting you to these changes and advising you we will be holding a identical meeting like this on November 6th, just right before the Gorge Commission meeting on November 12th, to give you one last opportunity to hear this information from Wasco County staff and to ask questions that you may have. But we do encourage folks to get in comments that they may have about these revisions early, and the deadline for that is October 22nd. And so we do have handouts that have this information, have where to send comments, and that'll be part of the presentation. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Tonight, I'm going to go over the proposed amendments, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the rules are now and what we're proposing. And weaving into them, I'm going to talk about those intended goals. So we've heard a lot of feedback from, in particular, Rowena community members, just as partners across the water, Columbia River Gorge Commission implements the National Scenic Area in Klickitat County. They've also been hearing a lot from residents who are impacted by the Burdoin fire. So that's why we've worked collaboratively. And I think we were really thrilled that the feedback we were hearing from residents was very similar to what they were hearing. And so I'm going to talk about some of those shared intended goals. I'm going to highlight what the process is so you're very clear on what the roadmap looks like moving forward, and then how to get involved in this process, because your involvement is really critical. In the state of Oregon, citizen involvement is our first goal for the statewide land use planning program, and we take that very seriously. And I want to share that those of you who were able to testify or wrote in testimony to the Gorge Commission when they were considering whether or not to allow the plan amendment to move forward, that was very impactful, according to commissioners. They expressed how grateful that they were that folks shared their experiences. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so the first sort of couple updates that I want to talk about are process related, permit process related. So as the National Scenic Area Management Plan reads right now, you have 2 years from a disaster incident to apply for a redevelopment 1-for-1 permit. And here at the bottom, what a 1-for-1 permit is, it's essentially, you're going to put pretty much the same structure in the same footprint with this kind of same size, same type. And that includes utilities, decks, porches, garages. So that's when we talk about 1-for-1, that's what we're talking about. What we're proposing, based on all the research that we've done, talking to state experts, looking at the national data, is we're proposing to increase that timeline for up to 10 years to begin redevelopment. So you will have to get a permit within that 10 years. And really the recommendation is going to be you need to talk probably to your local planning staff. I would say between 6 and 8 years to make sure that we have a good individual redevelopment plan for you, because sometimes permits can take some time. But the goal is to increase that 2 years to give folks some time to work through their individual recovery process. So the language in the National Scenic Area Management Plan is unclear that a one-for-one replacement is expedited. And our partners at Gorge Commission did look through their records and did determine that this section in the management plan had been interpreted differently. And so what we've asked and advocated for is making it really clear that this will be an expedited permit. And I'm going to talk in the next slide about what an expedited permit is. But essentially, we want to make it really clear so there's no opportunity for appeal or difference of opinion about it being an expedited permit. And then finally, Gorge Commission staff have put into the proposal a directive for Gorge Commission staff to develop an advisory handout on requirements, because I think we've all heard that feedback from residents, that it would be really helpful to understand the requirements, the types of materials that can be used. And so this revision would make that a requirement. I'm going to skip ahead here to what an expedited permit is. So an expedited permit is a permit that limits the protections that planners consider when they're reviewing a permit for development. So the National Scenic Area, one of the primary goals is to protect scenic, natural, cultural, and recreation resources. An expedited permit shrinks some of that analysis and essentially makes it a faster permit for staff to review and for our partners to participate in that reviewing process. So what the intended outcome of that is it makes the permit faster and it helps us reduce the cost. So if we are to be successful with this ask to make one-for-one replacements expedited, we will be able to charge expedited permit fee, which is $15.80 instead of the higher charge. Okay, 38, yeah. Okay, so the next series of changes have to do with the actual one-for-one replacement and talks about the regulations with respect to structures. So currently, the rules as written in the management plan state that when you're doing this one-for-one replacement, you can have an up to 10% increase and still qualify for one-for-one. We heard a lot from residents really early on that this was problematic for many homes in Rowena because many of these homes are mid-century homes, middle of last century homes, and a lot of manufacturing homes where the manufacturing standards and the building code standards have changed pretty dramatically over 70 plus years. And so when we talked about the regulations and how to be more equitable and more flexible, what we're proposing to the commission is a sliding scale. And what that does is creates a tier that would allow an increase in size to still qualify for the one-for-one replacement. And staff has prepared a couple of diagrams with some numbers that were done with the presentation. You can kind of take a look at to give you an idea of what those numbers would look like. But if you have a home that's under 1250, you could be eligible for up to 20%, making your structures up to 20% larger. And then it kind of titrates down depending on your size. The cap is 3,000 square feet. And why that's a cap is that in the management plan, that it tends to be a trigger for what's called compatibility analysis. So making sure that any structure that's being placed is consistent with the neighborhood character, the area character. And that has to do with scenic considerations and some other things. So two other things that we heard from residents, and I think planning staff have encountered in working through some applications that we have in our office now, is that wall height and height have been challenging, again, because manufacturing standards are different. So what's being proposed is that wall height can actually go up to 9 feet, which is a standard wall height for manufactured dwellings. And height should be the same unless there's some kind of building codes or manufacturing requirements that require a taller height. Because we assume most dwellings tend to be around the same height. So there's a little less wiggle room, but wall height is that critical piece because again, we know in Rowena, at least we're dealing with a lot of manufactured homes, again, from the middle of last century. So I'm going to move on to the next, which is temporary uses. This is something that we've been asked a lot from the Rowena community. I think probably has also come up over in Burdoin. And that's the ability to, one, stay in an RV on your property long-term while you're rebuilding and redeveloping. And two, to put up some kind of temporary structure for storage. So we recognize that this is a need that the community hasn't as expressed. The rules as written right now, they permit a maximum stay in an RV on your property of up to 60 years in a calendar, or 60 days, excuse me, in a calendar year. So it's really 2 months window. And what we're proposing to change the rules to say is that it would allow landowners to live in a temporary dwelling, so that's RV, manufactured home, a yurt, until they can actually occupy their replacement dwelling. And three, the proposal is to allow for temporary storage structures like sheds to be placed on site until the redevelopment can be complete. And we're hoping that that's going to be really helpful to residents as they move through the recovery process. There are some sideboards to these provisions. One, it can't be located in a resource site or a buffer zone, and your planning staff will help talk you through that. They have access to that information. The other piece is that landowners will be required every 2 years, which is common how we do it outside in the county with temporary uses. You'll have to submit documentation to the planning department and we'll verify your continued need. And that's just to make sure we don't have code compliance issues coming up and that we're keeping in touch with how your recovery is going. If you have a home business, as an example, and you're concerned about, and you have a permit, like a conditional use permit to have a home-based business, and you're concerned about from the loss of a structure, what do? My home is gone. How do I continue my home-based business? Will that discontinue my permit? The proposal, right now, it would discontinue the use. The proposal is that the lost structure won't result in the discontinued use. So there'll be some continuity, again, while you're working through recovery. So one of the goals in creating to that sliding scale, so that's where if you're under 1250, you can go up to 20%. I talked a little bit about this, but one of the things that we heard a lot from citizens and what staff really felt when they looked at the rules was this need for some flexibility. Because again, in a lot of these communities, we're talking about pre-scenic area development, where manufacturing standards were very different, building code standards were very different. And so needing that flexibility for things like wall height, for things like the size of the structure. We've had residents come in and say, I inherited this house. It was built maybe in the 30s or 40s. It's only 600 square feet and I've got a family of 4. I need to go a little bit bigger to accommodate my family. And so that's really what the goal is. And I've shared too that right now the rule as written treats all structures the same size with that 10% increase. But that does lead to some challenges when you get into the larger end range of houses. So because then you start to brush up against that compatibility analysis, and what that does for a potential application is create potentially an appeal issue. And so we want to be really careful and cautious with how we structure it so that we're really removing any opportunities for appeal on these one-for-one permits. So I mentioned one of the questions that we've heard over and over is, can I live in my RV? Can I have a temporary shed? And the answer has been, right now, we don't have a process to permit that. So one of the most immediate asks that we mentioned to the Gorge Commission when we were there in July was this was an issue that we wanted to target. And again, the proposal is going to allow, if passed, if approved, allow for folks to live in not an RV, but potentially a manufactured home or yurt or some other type of temporary housing. Some of this is going to be dependent on the state of infrastructure on site. You know, if you have a manufactured home, it will need to be hooked up to water and sewer. RV, not necessarily. We can work with public health on some solutions for that, but I think this is definitely a potential win for residents. And then the other thing we heard a lot, planners have heard a lot, almost immediately, is this need for temporary storage. That folks want to be engaged in their property. They want, you know, maybe they want to cut down some trees, maybe they want to do some landscaping, maybe they want to sift through things, and so they need to have tools, and having a storage site on site is going to be really helpful for that recovery process. So again, we are proposing language to allow for a temporary accessory structure like a shed. There are size limitations. It is a permitting process, so you do have to work with our team on that once these rules are passed. But again, I think hopefully going to meet some of those needs that we've heard about from our community. So as a whole, we have some other intended goals with these proposed revisions. I want to make clear, I've got another, the next slide is talking about isn't addressed. But we looked, under the guidance of the Gorge Commission, we wanted to have a really focused scope in order to make it really easy to say yes to this proposal. And one of the things that we've focused on is the state of national trends of recovery and what that actually looks like. So we know from 2020 in Oregon, 2 years is a challenge for some residents. Not all residents. We've I think we have 1 application approved, 4 in our queue. So some residents are going very quickly through the process, but we know not everybody has the ability to do that. So giving some breathing room to get through that permitting process, we think is really going to be helpful and recognizes what we understand to be national trends. We have talked about clarifying those building and wall height requirements, increasing that flexibility, recognizing that the way we built things, manufactured homes in the 1950s and 60s looks really different for lots of public health, life, and safety reasons, giving us a little bit of wiggle room to allow people to bring it into current standards, we think is a success for everybody. And then we've heard a lot of folks really concerned about permitting times and also permitting costs. And one of the benefits that we see from this is that it will dramatically reduce the amount of staff time needed for folks who qualify for one-for-one. And it will enable us to pass, enable us to only have to require that expedited permit fee, which is considerably more affordable than our full scenic area review fee. So, like I mentioned, when we brought this proposal to the Gorge Commission in July, there was a lot of conversation. Then this was followed up by a more formal request by the Gorge Commission staff in September. We had a lot of dialogue about what would be covered under this revision. There's an appetite for other types of revisions in the management plan, But what I believe the conversation that I heard from the Gorge Commission is that we needed to keep it very focused. Because when we start to add in lots of other elements, it really complicates it. And this is a change that will impact not just Rowena and Burdoin residents, but residents throughout the Columbia River National Scenic Area. So it's going to impact residents in Klickitat, Wasco, Skamania, Hood River, Multnomah, and Clark County. And when we get that many folks thinking issues and weighing in, it can become really, really complicated. And so the last management plan process took 4 years because the scope was so large. So what the request was of staff is to keep our focus, our scope pretty narrow so that we could be successful. So I want to be clear about what's not going to be covered by the updates. The first thing is one-for-one is this one-for-one replacement language as it exists in the management plan. Really, there isn't another provision for replacements that don't meet that one-for-one. So again, one-for-one means in the same footprint, about the same size, the same type of housing. So you're just trying to put back what you had before. We didn't have provisions for something new, something different. The way the management plan is designed, it makes you go through the full scenic area review because there's an assumption new and different development is going to have new and different impacts to the resources the scenic area is trying to protect. So I want to be clear that if you don't qualify for whatever reason for a one-for-one replacement, you do have to go through the full scenic area review. That is not covered in this proposed revision. We've heard a lot of feedback from community members about materials like metal roofs, and we know that that's been a source of conversation even at the commission level. We do allow they just have to be non-reflective. Some discussion about maybe changing the language in the management plan. But again, as I've shared, it makes it really, really complicated. So I think what the request has been is to put those things, table them for the bigger, larger update. So we'll take a look at the metal roof situation with the future update. We're not going to handle it with this update. One of the things that with the one-for-one replacement, you're not free and clear of all scenic area protections. You do have to meet those standards of visual subordinates, which again doesn't mean invisible. It just means it has to be subordinate. It has to be, and I think staff brought some pictures about what subordinate looks like to give you a good picture of that. But it means it basically has to blend in with the background and not be the prominent foreground. So we want it to kind of blend in with the scenery. We still have to take that under consideration, and that includes the color of structures. So new structures are going to have to meet those dark earth tone requirements with your roof, with your siding, with the trim. And again, that's not going to be covered in this update. Okay, so what the process looks like as we know it today. This is a working process. That means that reviewing bodies are making law. And so there's a lot of process that goes into that. Some of it is according to federal law that dictates what the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area does. And some of it is state law that governs how we make rules about land use planning. And some of it's local law. So I talked at the top of the public comment period. The draft has been released by Gorge Commission staff. It's on their website. You'll have seen a staff report accompanying that. Then it has to go for 30 days for public comment. Public comments are due on October 22nd. Staff will look at all that, will read those comments, kind of look at the themes, but also look at some of the substantive comments and then consider revisions to the proposal ahead of the Gorge Commission hearing. on November 12th. For hearings of this kind, staff always have to have a staff report and any proposals a week in advance. So the materials will be released, I think is it the 5th or is it the 6th? 6th. And that's when we're going to have a second meeting. Again, we are sending out a postcard notice and to Wasco County residents who live in the National Scenic Area, telling you about that meeting, telling you where to find information. But you'll have another opportunity to hear this same information so that you can again make comments if you would like to the Gorge Commission once you read the revised draft. Then will be the hearing. The hearing is on November 12th, which is a little unusual. Gorge Commission meetings are almost always on Tuesdays. We do have Veterans Day in observation on that Tuesday. So they've moved that meeting to the Wednesday. So they'll have the hearing. The hope is there will be approval of these proposed revisions after some discussion, of course. And then that will allow the Gorge Commission staff to advance it to the United States Secretary of Agriculture. This is part of the federal process that's dictated in the National Scenic Act. The Secretary of Ag reviews the changes and they issue what's called concurrence. So they basically say, what you're proposing meets with the intent of the National Scenic Act. And it's basically like an approval. So then they send Christina and her staff a letter saying we concur. We don't know what the window of that looks like. It has varied pretty wildly, I would say, from update to update.
30 to 90 days.
It's usually 30 to 90 days. So sometimes it's been 30.
Yes.
Sometimes it's been 90. We don't really know how to predict that. Especially since we have a change in Secretary of Ag since the last update. So we're hopeful it'll get done within 30 days, but I want to set the expectation that could take up to 90 days. Once Christina gets that letter of concurrence, she then sends that out to the counties. And she sends a letter and it says, you have basically almost a year to make these updates to your ordinance. Wasco County is primed and ready to go once we receive that letter, but we do have to go through 3 hearings in order to adopt at the local level. We go to the Planning Commission first. We have to wait 20 days between the Planning Commission, and then we have to have 2 Board of County Commissioner hearings. Usually the second is, they read it by title only, which means they just say, okay, do we have consensus about passing that? But that process typically takes a minimum 3 months. We're going to work really hard to make it shorter, but I want to set the expectation that it could be up to 3 months. Once we complete the local process, then we send it back to the Gorge Commission and we say, here's our ordinance, here's what we've adopted. They review it for consistency with the management plan, which again, one of the great things about it being a narrow scope is that that's pretty easy for their staff to turn around. They have to have a hearing about that, and then it has to go back to the Secretary of Agriculture. So that's why we've got a range here at the bottom of what we think staff, an educated guess about what we think the time will be. And that's about 7 to 12 months. So once we get the rubber stamp from the second rubber stamp from the US DA, so the Secretary of Agriculture, I'm okay to implement locally. So all of these revisions that I've talked about, even when if the Gorge Commission approves in November, staff won't be able to implement until we go through all that process. So I want to set the expectation that if you're one of those go-getters who wants to go now, I would advise talking to our staff. And I've got some information about that on the next slide. So applications that are in our queue that we've reviewed already, or folks who are really ready to go, they're going to be processed under the current rules. You won't have access to these new rules until all of that process I just talked about is complete. Right now, for full scenic area reviews, it ranges from anywhere from 4 months to over a year. And why it ranges is because if you have a cultural resource on your site, that can take time for the archaeologist to go and do some assessments about how to best protect those cultural resources. Average time, according to staff, for expedited reviews is about 2 to 3 months. But what I can say is that our staff did an incredible amount of pre-work just immediately when the incident happened. So in June, they've done an incredible amount of research on every single property impacted in Rowena. And they've been holding panel meetings with folks to talk about individual redevelopment plans. So we've got a lot of that legwork done. We know where some of the pitfalls on individual properties are going to be. Staff has been working incredibly hard to process these applications, even full scenic area reviews, pretty darn quickly. So our first was a full scenic area review. They were able to complete that in about the expedited time period. I think for the other 4, it's probably going to vary because, again, we've got some complicating factors. But just know our staff, whether you want to go now and you want to work through the rules as written, or you want to wait, staff's going to do everything they can to make that process easy and smooth and quick for you. This is, again, meeting with staff on a one-by-one basis, or taking advantage of some of the panel meetings we've had where you can sit down with planning division staff on site, which is our septic folks from public health and building code services, is such a good way for you to make some of these educated decisions about the timing of your redevelopment permits and how you want to move forward. Okay, so I'm nearing the end of my presentation, and I'm going to talk about how to get involved. Thank you again for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. The Gorge Commission has put up an FAQ and an overview on their website, as well as the revisions in the staff report. We do have copies of those here tonight if you want to take that home with you and have a paper version of it. I've got the URL for folks online, so you can just click that and find the information online and be able to download it. As I mentioned, comments to have staff consider your feedback are due by October 22nd. So you have a little bit of time. If for whatever reason you're just not ready to comment by October 22nd, you can comment to November 12th. Typically, what Gorge Commission requests is comments are due the day before noon, to enter it into the packet. I would assume it's still going to be Monday because Tuesday's a holiday. So you'll just want to keep in mind, you'll want to have your comments to this public comment at gorgecommission.org Monday, the 10th at noon. And you can always reach out to staff here. We're happy to remind you of those rules. If it gets, fuzzy for you, we're happy to help walk you through that. I talked those development services panels. I think they've been really successful. We've had, a lot of interesting conversations, and I think helping people work through their individual redevelopment plans. I think that's why we've been able to process, 1 permit so quickly and then having 4 in the queue. So if you only hear one thing today, really want to encourage, reach out to Wasco County Planning Division staff, set up an appointment to talk about your individual recovery plan. For those of you who are impacted by the related and you're just paying attention because you live in the scenic area, you're also always welcome to reach out to our professional staff and talk a little bit through how this may impact you. You can also start, meetings one-on-one with any of our staff. If you have a planner that you really like to work with, that's okay too. We encourage you to do that. So that concludes my formal presentation. Again, I thank you so much for being here tonight. I thank our partners with the Columbia River Gorge Commission and appreciate our representative, Roger Nichols, who's currently serving as the Wasco County Columbia Gorge Commissioner for Wasco County. Appreciate him being here tonight to listen to the presentation and kind of be aware of what we're doing. This presentation will be posted online on the website. It'll also be shared on Facebook. So if you need a copy of it to share with friends and neighbors, you're welcome to reach out. And I'm going to conclude the presentation there. Again, reminder, we'll get a postcard in the mail. November 6th, we'll be back here to give this same presentation. And if you have any questions, please, I encourage you very strongly to reach out to staff. We're here to help. Thank you so much.